Good morning, members. This is the Corporate Scrutiny panel. This meeting is being held both in person and remotely, as some members were unable to attend today. I'm going to start by introducing myself. So I'm John Taylor, I'm chairman of the panel. And then if I can just start, Tyler, if we can just go round and if members can introduce themselves.
Yeah, sure thing, thank you. Tyler Hawkins, Dalton councillor. Yeah.
James Ryan, Co-op T.
Alex Leakage, Dewsbury councillor.
Harry McCarthy, councillor for Colne Valley.
Councillor John Mawson, Cleckheaton.
And Gary, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Gary Kitchen, another Co-op T. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Jenny, do we, should we do the minutes of the previous meeting first? So the minutes have been circulated, the meeting on the 5th of July, 2022. Is everybody happy with the contents of the minutes? Yep. Okay. Everybody happy? Thank you. So they're approved. Do we have any apologies?
Christina Park.
So just Christina.
Yes.
We also have Councillor Steve Hall, who is hoping to join us online, should be joining shortly. I am going to change round the agenda slightly. So agenda item 7, Cabinet Member Update on Priorities and Council Plan, will come later in the agenda as Councillor Paul Davis will be joining us slightly late. So moving on to item 3, interests. Do councillors have any interests to declare? No? If you do decide during the meeting you do have interest, if you could please complete the form that's enclosed with papers and hand it to Jenny at the end of the meeting. Thank you. Admission of the public. Are we okay to hold this in a public session?
Yes.
Okay. Everybody happy with holding it in a public session? Thank you. Do we have any deputations or petitions?
No received, Chair.
Okay. Do we have any members of the public who wish to ask any questions?
No questions received.
Thank you. Right. Well, we'll move on to item 8, which is a presentation on the draft social policy, social value policy that's been worked on, and Chris Duffel and Jonathan are going to introduce that for me. Okay, over to you guys.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just quickly take you through the main points of the paper. I'm Chris Duffel, Head of Business Economy and Growth at the Council, and have been heavily involved with Jonathan and colleagues in putting or developing a proposed new social value policy for the Council. I think it's a fair reflection to say that social value has become an increasingly important focus for both the public and the private sectors. In essence, trying to optimise the social, economic, and environmental benefit of every pound invested, is and should be a priority. The Council's policy. Current policy was put in place in 2013, not long after the Public Social Value Act, which after that legislation was enacted, which set a requirement for public sector bodies to consider social value in some procurement activity. So that policy's been in place for nearly 10 years. The new policy, which you've got the current draft attached to the paper. The new policy, I think, acknowledges some important changes or important developments that we need to take into account. One is a need to consider and embed social value much more widely in relation to the Council's activities. So, yes, embracing all of the commissioning and procurement that the Council undertakes, but also considering social value when it comes to making grants to both public and private sector organisations in issues like asset transfer, in some of the wider investments that the Council makes, and also importantly as a consideration in determining planning applications. Secondly, I think the other significant change that's addressed in the policy is the need for commissioners to consider social value outcomes and how they might be achieved at a much earlier stage of the project development process. So very often, and you know, this council is far from unique in this sense. Very often, traditionally, social value considerations are, you know, come to the fore when we're at the procurement stage of commissioning, and the policy acknowledges that it's very important that we consider social value much earlier in the process, really at the outset when ideas are being formulated. I guess the other points I wanted to make before I hand over to Jonathan to kind of pick up any other issues. The policy represents part of what we're trying to achieve here, but it's only part of it, and therefore understanding, you know, the council's wider approach and our capacity to deliver social value is going to be absolutely critical if the policy is going to have any impact. So there are a set of proposals which you see before you in the paper around how the policy will be implemented. One part of that process will be to identify a lead within each service to really develop and embed social value knowledge and capacity, so that knowledge and understanding is sort of spread and embedded throughout the council's commissioning services. Developing a program of training and action learning. Thanks, Jenny. You don't want to hear two of me speaking at the same time. I think one is probably more than enough. So, yeah, developing a program of training and action learning for those service leads. So again, that understanding and knowledge is shared across the council. Developing new guidance and resources for project managers, and importantly, I think increasing the visibility of social value commitments in the way that we commission and manage contracts, and ensuring that there is that greater focus in place. As part of that, it's also proposed to embed social value into the council's corporate reporting arrangements and KPIs. So there are some specific measures which emerge from this process, and that process of building our internal capacity and then assessing the business case to potentially create some additional dedicated social value capacity is an important part of the process. I think at this stage it's very much about putting the new policy in place, putting the implementation mechanisms in place, and then understanding whether there is a case for additional capacity to be built into those services over and above the existing roles that we're looking to ensure have a stronger focus on social value. I think that was all I wanted to add. Jonathan, did you want to add anything further to that?
I think you've covered most of the bases. I was just crossing off my points as you went. I think the two things that it's worth mentioning in addition are how we go about measuring social value. And so this is fairly well developed in the procurement space, both in terms of the indicators that we might use, the measures, and the tools. So nationally, there is something called the National TOMS framework, which is themes, outcomes, and measures, which sets out broadly 4 areas in which you might look to achieve social value, and a number of outcomes which kind of provide a lower level grouping, and then the measures, which are the individual outcomes that you might be looking for, say number of apprenticeship opportunities through a procurement, etc. And then against those, they map locally varied proxy values so that we can quantify and compare against potential providers in the procurement space. But we need to work on that to develop how that maps onto the other areas in which we're looking to achieve social value. The other thing is just to make really explicit, this is not the procurement strategy. The procurement strategy will be coming to you next month to this committee. And so this really sets the frame for what social value is, the areas that we'll be looking to achieve social value in, and then the procurement strategy will go into some of the detail around how we will look to achieve social value within the procurement space, as opposed to some of the other areas that are identified in this policy.
Thank you, Chair. It's great to see this this come forward. Really good to see this come forward. Long overdue, I think, isn't it? It's good to see this aspect, social value, being built in to our procurement and our other services that we're doing. I toddled off and had a look at the LGA toolkit to have a look through and see where we matched and if there were any differences. The interesting thing about the toolkit was when it started talking about remedial action, so that if we were faced with non-delivery of social value that we'd stipulated, it's seen as a last resort, obviously. And I just wonder, once we've arrived at that decision that actually we're not getting the value that we thought we'd discussed and agreed on with the providers, how successful have some of the measures like clawback and retention been elsewhere? Do we have any overview of that? Do we have any view of, or is it a kind of an agreement that we have with the providers that actually, if you don't deliver, these are the measures that are going to be taken, and that's a standard procedure? Thanks.
First of all, I think I'll refer back to my last comment that actually this isn't the procurement strategy, and this very much relates to contract management in the procurement space. And the other thing that's really important is that at the moment we've not found ourselves in that situation. So there are, as you will have seen in the LJ toolkit, a number of approaches to be taken, such as negotiating other opportunities where social value could be delivered. So, as an example, they may have committed to recruiting 5 local people. Actually, that's proved to be impossible. And so looking at, well, what are the opportunities where they could provide some other social value to the same or a similar value. I know that actually thinking about it, that has been the case in, I think it was a Spen Valley Leisure Centre project. Because of the context building during COVID, actually that meant that the provider couldn't deliver a number of the commitments that they had made, but through a really amicable relationship with that provider, we were able to come to alternative arrangements. I don't believe we've got as far as having to look at clawback arrangements and that kind of thing, but Jane Lockwood would be able to provide more detail on that when she comes next time to present on the procurement strategy.
Just a last comment, really. Just to say that I think we should be very forthright and bold in employing this. Most companies that we deal with have a statement of their own to do with social value, and we should be claiming that part of that part of the contracts. We should not be timid in doing this, because if we don't take it, then quite frankly somebody else will. It will go elsewhere. So yes, I'd like to see this sort of employed sort of really kind of in a very sort of straight up fashion. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. I think the concept of social value really encompasses a wide range of concerns that residents have with different proposals, and I think a lot of the time, thinking about its highest level, residents come to council, they say, oh, I've got this concern about this proposal, and it falls within the category of social value, and the residents are perceiving a sort of a net negative social value in that proposal. So I was just wondering, is there a concept of negative social value that the policy ought to consider? Because I can also imagine you're often trading off different kinds of social value with particular proposals. So there's a positive side to measuring social value, but also potentially, a subtraction of social value in certain proposals.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. I think it's a very pertinent question. I guess it's fair to say, from a policy perspective, we have looked at the other side of the equation primarily. So it's particularly around how can the council ensure that it's extracting as much value as is possible in each case. One thing to say is with an enhanced policy in place, it will be easier to have discussions around social value, and I think the kind of impacts that you're alluding to with private sector developers. It was certainly the case that the intention here as we move forward is to be able to ensure that social value is an increasingly important part of planning considerations, and this policy will if adopted, will be an important stepping stone, I think, to be able to do that. Whether it which should necessarily get into consideration, I sense you're probably sort of moving into territory around planning policy, etc., which we wouldn't expect this policy to cover specifically. But certainly the intention is that it gives us a platform to be able to have robust conversations with developers around the social value benefits that individual schemes will bring. Yes.
Thanks for that response. Yeah, I think it's mainly about planning policy, but can be other sorts of proposals as well, where they might be trading off different kinds. I did note in the draft social value policy, it says an intention about incorporating social value considerations and statements of social value into major development proposals, and it struck me that potentially that aspect might pass many communities by. Because if you imagine we've got smaller communities with a lot less development land, or already very heavily developed communities with less development land, so major proposals, major developments might be very rare. So I was just wondering if that specific detail of the types of developments where social value might be a consideration, whether that might be worth leaving a bit more towards the local plan review rather than sort of specifying major developments now, because I think there is a potential of some communities missing out.
Yeah, I think clearly there is a need to ensure that the social value policy is aligned with current local plan policy and is fit for purpose in terms of local plan policy for the future. So I think certainly understand and agree with the link that you're trying to make here, and agree that in that context it wouldn't be appropriate for the social value policy that's coming up for Cabinet's consideration in September, wouldn't be appropriate for it to get into a great deal of detail around matters that are better dealt with through wider planning policy considerations. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's something that we can look at incorporating into the policy. I mean, there's already a hook there in terms of discussing that issue. And I think it's worth saying as well that actually the social value policy takes as its starting point the assumption that something is going to be done. And it's really important to recognise that there is and needs to be consideration of social benefits and other benefits in the business case process for deciding whether we're going to do something, identifying, as you say, through the local plan process where there is a need for intervention, and that's our starting point for identifying sites, whether that be for employment, for housing, etc., and then leading on to other elements of the local plan framework.
Thank you. I didn't last very long observing only. I'm sorry, Chair. I'm a little bit confused, because your report says that you've had a policy in place since 2013, But a lot of these seem to be talking about the need for training and the need for funding for training and going into having KPIs and things like this. And it's not easy to see from the report what the differences are between the policy from 2013 and the new policy. So what impact did the previous policy have, and how have you enhanced this policy to make sure that there is a real step change, presumably? That's what you're looking for. And you're also talking about, in your policy, you're talking about grants of over 50,000 needing a social values statement. How are you supporting community groups who may be looking for grants of that amount or over to be able to develop the social value statement that's needed? Thank you.
To take your first point initially, and thank you for those questions, they're really important ones. Apologies, the report doesn't really make clear what the impacts have been of the existing policy, or kind of draw out really clearly the development from there. So the first thing to say is, and I think this is the one point we are really clear on, the existing policy is very much focused on procurement, and the guidance document that supports it makes clear that it needs to start earlier in the process and not just when it arrives at procurement. But we've neither had the capacity to focus on it before procurement, or the understanding as that's developed over time, and particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, we've become more ambitious on this, and we've learned a lot in that process. So one of the key things will be looking to make sure that projects don't arrive at procurement, and that is when social value starts to be considered, but that is designed in from a much earlier stage. So considering what is it we're going to deliver, what might the opportunities be for providing social value, whether that be in employment or supporting local VCS organisations, etc. And then, as I say, it makes it much broader than procurement, and kind of sets a vision almost for being able to talk about the social value that is being delivered by the council as a whole, whether that be through the grant making work, whether that be through our employment practices, and asset transfer, and each of those different areas, so that we can talk about actually these are the impacts you might be able to see in the district, but this is the other stuff that's happening that you probably don't see, but it is really important that we're able to quantify that and explain that those have been significant benefits of the work that the council's been doing as well. Chris, did you want to take the grants point?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly the intention, is not to make that process for voluntary community sector organisations in any way onerous. And I think as the paper alludes to, we've certainly been having conversations with organisations around third sector leaders around how we can both in one sense build their capacity to be able to kind of implement anything arising from the report, but particularly build their capacity to be able to capitalise on opportunities. So in that context, I don't think in this case we'd see that as being anything onerous, and certainly that would be far from the intention.
Thanks. Can I just ask that, I realise you're talking to third sector leaders as the body, but my question is about how the council is going to support community groups. Because personally, as a ward councillor, I don't know a lot of community groups who are involved in third sector leaders. Okay, so I know of some, but they're not all linked into third sector leaders. And so they would look initially to the council for that information. So it needs to be in several places. This is what I'm saying. It can't just be in the one place. Okay. Thank you.
Entirely agree with that. I mean, obviously we've tried to work with third sector leaders as the main infrastructure body for the VCSE in Kirklees, but as you know from other conversations we've had, it's not representative to the extent that we want it to be. And all the success we had with the community champion model developed a whole other set of grassroots community groups. So we've got a third sector team who sits within Emily's bit of the world, who provide that bespoke support if TSL aren't in the position to be able to do that. And then we've got relationships with people like One Community who do certain things for us. So it's all linked to that VCSE investment strategy, but you're absolutely right. There are much more smaller groups that need that bespoke support that, you know, the council does need to provide.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one, really. Will it be ready for the cultural heart, this policy? I think it's coming to Cabinet next month, I think, is it? But what I'm thinking is, are we ready to do this at scale? Because there will be a lot of money being spent over the next few years, and the scale of that task in terms of this policy seems quite large, and we're back to the capacity issue, I guess, again. But are we ready for that kind of scale of practice?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. The short answer is yes. It is being firmly factored into the cultural heart considerations, and I think, you know, really important that that's the case. I mean, you know, clearly hugely important project for a whole series of reasons, and absolutely will have social value considerations built into that. And I've been Jonathan and I have been having those discussions with Councillor Davis and others specifically about how we do that. I know Councillor Davis wants to come in, I think.
You're on mute.
There we go. First one of the day on mute. Well, first one for me. My apologies, Chair and members of the panel. I've not been able to be there in person. I was there, but my wife has tested positive for COVID, so obviously I've returned home. Yeah, I've missed part of you know what's you've been going through in this, but I think a couple of points just want to pick up from my perspective, and just to create an emphasis. For me, as the portfolio holder, and certainly the message I'm communicating through Cabinet, is this is a very crucial element of our approach going forward, and it is about delivering some real value out of this as well. So today you're talking about policy clearly, but as Chris just said, we're going through and been going through some really detailed conversations around the outcomes. For example, as Councillor Lawson asked, the cultural heart, there's great opportunities there to really make a difference in terms of that social value contribution from those companies. And it'll be, you know, that discussion is very much around our focus as an administration and council, what we feel will benefit the communities, and they will be real outcomes and not just, if you like, well-meaning words. I think the history, which you've probably gone through, of social value is that, you know, it's been around for a few years now. I think many organisations have struggled with this. I know in discussions had with West Yorkshire Combined Authority some months ago, they were literally embarking on a similar journey to ourselves. So it's got that emphasis from me as a portfolio holder. I'm pretty passionate about this because I think it really does give us opportunities, not just to deliver major developments like the cultural heart, but to ensure there's a legacy from those developments in a whole range of areas, and particularly that link with the community and creating ways of funding and supporting community activities in a sustainable way going forward. So it was just really to make sure that the panel are aware that this is not just something which is, if you like, discussed at an officer level. This is very much right there on top of my agenda, and certainly something that, you know, the Cabinet are hugely supportive as well. but it is, you know, we are pushing on some fairly new ground with some of this, and I think it's not that we want to be the lead or the first in this area. We just want to make sure that we deliver for our communities as well. And both Chris and John are doing a great job in terms of the work on that. But there will be more, obviously, when we look at procurement, there will be more detail around procurement, around how we're affecting this in that respect. But I totally agree with the comments earlier that this is more than that. This is about creating a mindset where it becomes the norm, that one of the first things you talk about when you look at any particular contract, any particular services, what social value are we getting out of that? Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. I think you went into this a little bit in your response to Councillor Lucich's question, but could you explain a little bit how these new social value obligations for major developments would differ from the existing Section 106 process? And also, what powers will we have in place to stop developers basically wriggling out of these social value obligations? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose the first important point says there is a local plan policy which covers an adopted local plan policy which covers social value benefits. I think it's probably fair to say that for a whole series of reasons, at inquiry, the policy which resulted was perhaps not as strong and as robust as the council would have wished. So whatever we do has to be in line with the existing adopted local plan policy. Is there an appetite at officer level to ensure that consideration of planning applications, and particularly major developments, takes social value into account and utilises Section 106 and other legal agreements to embed and enforce those? Yes, there is. So in that sense, it will remain at this stage something that we have to enter into negotiations with an individual developer around in the context of the existing local plan policy, but there is a definite need to ensure that we do that as robustly as possible and utilise Section 106 and other agreements where we can.
If I can ask a couple of questions, I thought I'd give members a chance first. I've seen this paper before. We had a briefing, and I do have this tendency to ask the questions in the briefing as well. So I think some questions I've already asked. But I'd just like to follow on from the comments from Harry around the Section 106 and the social value commitment within major developments. Quite often, major developers will present the development as a benefit for the community in its own right because they're delivering more housing. Is that a social value delivery? Or how do we differentiate between just them building a load of houses and them genuinely providing some additional social value? So I've got a couple of questions, but perhaps if we just take that one first. I think you get it, don't you?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Taylor. I think part of this is really looking for a step change in our approach to how we articulate our social value asks. Because I'd agree with you, house builder merely building a lot of houses, not employing local residents, not employing local, not using local supply chains, isn't optimising the kind of wider benefit to the area. So I think part of this is very much around, through data and intelligence and bringing that together. I think the council being able to be more prescriptive or perhaps more demanding in terms of what its social value asks are. And that's something that we obviously need a policy framework and a basis to be able to be able to do that. So I think I would equally apply that logic to, as we touched on earlier, you know, our sort of major capital projects, Cultural Heart and others, where I think there is a recognition that we need to be more prescriptive and clearer at the outset around what our social value asks are, rather than merely waiting for a contractor or a developer to propose something. So I think that will be one of the ways in which there is a step change in the approach, if that's helpful.
Kind of, but I think I'm just going to push it a little further if I can. Quite a lot of the houses that are built across the district are built by the major developers. They're national firms. They use national supply chains. They use their own workforce. How do we really get social value into those sort of contracts? And what discussions have we had with the major developers about how we can help them move to a position where they're in a position to provide some social value for us, and they're not just building the same houses in the same way here that they do in Barnsley, that they do in, I don't know, somewhere down south, can't think of anywhere, Southampton.
Yeah, again, I think it's largely around that change in approach and emphasis. You know, moving forward at really a pre-application stage, before a developer submits a planning application, you know, we want to be in a position where social value conversations are happening at that early stage, and ideally there is an opportunity perhaps to shift the dial a little bit in terms of the approach that some of those national house builders might adopt. Certainly, I do think it's fair to say that there are some very positive examples in the private sector of I guess larger construction firms in particular that have adopted a much more perhaps enlightened approach to social value. You know, are very clear at articulating you know, what their approach is. We might still be looking for them to do more, but are also very good at reporting that in terms of their usual reporting framework. So I think there are some positive exemplars out there that we can look to use and look to engage other contractors around. This is all largely focused on obviously schemes moving forward. You know, clearly once a scheme has planning consent, once there are shovels in the ground, it's a lot harder to be able to retrofit this kind of approach, which just emphasises the need for us to be having the discussions early, whether it's private sector schemes or our own major projects.
Sorry, I'm going to keep pushing. So, have we spoken to the major developers about our proposals?
Yeah, we've certainly had conversations with a number of the larger framework contractors that we're working with, and also with some of the major landowners who have particular large housing schemes that are working their way through the planning system. Yes.
So, I'm not sure that was a question asked, but for me, the Barretts of this world, have we sat down and spoken to them and said this is what our ask is? Because if we haven't, there's two risks here. There's one, that they won't deliver it because they have a model, it's a national model, that's how they operate. Or secondly, we might find ourselves that there are certain builders who don't want to build in Kirklees because of our social value policy. So if we haven't had that conversation with those big builders and with those national companies that operate in that kind of, they build it the same wherever they build it, in the same way with the same supply chains and the same contractors and subcontractors, we haven't had those conversations yet. That's a gap in this policy. Because if we want them to come on board, we need to talk to them before we firm up what our policy is. Because we could find ourselves in a difficult position where they're not willing to compromise, or they may decide they'll go and build in poor Barnsley. They'll go and build in Barnsley instead of Kirklees. So I was being very specific about, have we had conversations with, I'm picking on Barrett, so I'm sure we can pick on some others. I can't think of any at the moment, but those sort of big, really big firms, have we had the conversations with any of them? Not contractors we're working with, not landowners, not the stuff that we're doing. These big firms that come in and build these big estates.
I'll try and be as specific as I can, Councillor. Yes, we've had conversations with some of those, I guess, larger landowners in particular. So just to give you one example, someone like the church commissioners and the site at Chidswell, there are discussions ongoing around social value in that context. Have we tested the policy with every single large house builder? No, it would be wrong to pretend that that's the case, but there have been some very specific conversations, yes.
Sorry, the church commissioners aren't a house builder. They're a landowner. I was being very specific about the actual builders themselves, because these firms have ways of working. It's not the church commissioners, and Chidswell's a bit sensitive issue with me, really. But anyway, so it's actually the building companies themselves that operate in a certain manner. If we haven't been out and spoken to them, probably there's a gap that we need to pick up and fill in to make sure that we understand whether our policy that we're proposing we think is really, really good actually is going to, you know, when it meets reality of the volume builders in the UK, if they're not willing to play, we put ourselves in a difficult position. So before we start, and before we say we've got a firm policy here that we understand, we need to know whether it works in the real world.
I think the first thing to say is that this policy really sets the opportunity to have that conversation and makes clear to developers that we will have that conversation. It's very important to differentiate that it doesn't set any benchmarks in terms of what we will aim to achieve through major developments at this stage, but that will be an early conversation. I think it's also important to say that it's possibly inevitable that certain companies will decide that actually they don't want to bring forward a particular development if the social value requirements are higher than they would wish them to be. And actually that is part of making sure that good companies are operating within Kirklees.
Thanks, Johnson. That's where the problem is, isn't it? Because we have an ambition to build a certain number of houses each year. If we set our social policy for the right reasons, in a way that is deemed to be onerous by some of the volume builders, and they choose not to build in Kirklees, it presents a problem for us in terms of achieving our housing target. So I'll come back to, and I'll keep coming back to the same point, we need to go talk to them now before we firm up on what our policy is, to make sure that we understand the consequences of the policy that we're trying to implement, and if necessary, tweak various bits of it in a way that we can make sure that we meet both those social value objectives, but also those very clear objectives of building the number of houses we need to build each year. What we don't want to do is have a superb policy and then find that 2 or 3 of the big volume builders no longer want to build in Kirklees. It would be bonkers to push ahead and implement a policy without having had those discussions. And what I'm hearing at the moment is we haven't had those discussions explicitly. And I think that's I don't know what the rest of the panel feels, but personally I would want that to be an action that we take away, to say we will go and have those conversations to make sure that the policy is fit for purpose when we implement the policy, because the volume builders are still going to be here. We're still going to be building the number of houses we need to build each year to meet our, our ambition.
Yeah, I think that's certainly an action we can take away.
I did keep quiet till everybody else had spoken. And we have touched on this when we met before. One of my concerns about this is all great and fantastic, but it's only in the delivery that it actually realises anything. And we will have discussions with various people, whether it's developers, whether it's community groups that are receiving grants, so whether it's some of the other funding that we make available, services we commission. The quality is in the checking that's done afterwards to make sure that they've delivered that social value. My concern is there's no additional new resources being put in to pick up that enforcement. We've talked a couple of times, a couple of people have picked up issues around enforcement and remedial action, etc. It sounds like we're going to have social value champions in each directorate, but they've also got a day job. In reality, they're not going to be going out and visiting to make sure that those 4 apprentices actually all do live in Kirklees, or that whatever else we've negotiated that they're delivering has actually been done. And if we're going to be reliant on, you know, just reporting coming back from these developers, people we've commissioned or whoever, actually very quickly they'll soon see through that. If nobody's checking, not much will happen. So I have a real worry that we're taking through a policy that's going to have some very strong commitments, but if we don't have resource behind it, it's probably not going to deliver what we hope it will achieve. So I'd just like to have some reassurance about how we're going to ensure, because we have planning enforcement and they struggle to do all the planning enforcement they need to do. So where's the enforcement going to come from? Who are the people that can be doing the enforcers, Kirklees enforcers? If anybody would take that one on.
So, I mean, the first thing to say is it's really important, and again, this slightly strays into the procurement area. When our suppliers are reporting back to say they've delivered on the social value, they're not simply whacking in a number without any evidence. Each of the measures is very clear of what evidence is required to be able to demonstrate that that social value commitment has been delivered. And so that is managed, supported by the system that we're using to achieve commitments and monitor their delivery. The other thing to say is that we recognise that social value is something still relatively new, that it's really important to develop people's understanding within each of our service areas, and so that they understand, and we understand, what social value looks like in each of their areas, how that is achieved, and what the right kind of support is in that. So, as the report says, we'll be looking to identify leads within each of the directorates and work with them to develop guidance of how their service areas can achieve social value, what resources are available for that, and we'll also work with them to understand what the right kind of support would look like, and at that point be able to put together a business case to understand whether we need to put in additional resource. But also referring to Councillor Davis's comments earlier, it's really important that this becomes something which is much more our business as usual. It is not simply our job is to build this road or to deliver social care, but actually how are we maximising, optimising the opportunities through that to deliver benefits for our communities, for our residents.
You're on mute, Gary.
Sorry, that's better. I do apologise. Thank you very much, Chair. Interesting debate so far, interesting ideas. There were just a couple of things that have sort of come to me while listening to all of this. First of all, if this is a policy to take forward, has there been any assessment or benchmarking of previous projects that have gone on, so you've got a good idea what a successful project looks like in terms of social value? A good way you can do that is look at something in the past. What did that look like through this lens, and then is that something you can increase? Secondly, I'm interested in the dilemmas that may exist between the project cost and the social value potential. For example, if there are two groups contracting for a certain project, if one of them offers double the social value benefits over 10 years rather than the other one offers lesser social value over a shorter period of time, how do you weigh that up in terms of the overall initial financial cost? Because there will be some things that are balanced out and juggled there. And thirdly, how will impacts on other services in Kirklees be considered? For example, if suddenly lots of these house builders start saying, great, we want to take on local apprentices, blah, 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 it might turn out that there's not enough apprentices of that nature in Kirklees. So how do you make sure that the services that provide the resources that are needed to meet the social value commitments are done? Because there could be a big pull on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone want to pick these up? 3 questions.
Thank you for those questions. We've just divvied up who will respond to each of them. So I'll take 1 and 2, and Chris will respond to the third, as he's got much more detailed knowledge in that area. So in terms of assessment and benchmarking, this is something that we're looking to increase, particularly on very significant projects, so that we can understand what have we been able to achieve both locally, but also in other areas where local authorities are taking similar approaches. So, for instance, on the cultural heart, we've looked at what has been achieved in areas such as Salford and Barnsley. To understand how has that worked, what have they been able to achieve, what does good look like in that space, and so that is something that we'll be looking to do more regularly. In terms of the trade-off between the project cost and the social value opportunities, from the way you framed that question, it's largely a procurement question, but just to explain briefly that social value is one of the areas that are considered within a procurement exercise. So when we're looking at who has bid for a piece of work, they are evaluated against cost, against quality, and also on social value. And the social value weighting is generally around 10% that we're using, though we're very clear that we will vary that according to the kind of service or good that we're procuring, depending on the how developed the market is in social value. But I think the point that you're really making is, does that change who we end up contracting? And already in our experience, that has made the difference. But again, Jane Lockwood will be able to give you much more detail on how that is working in practice when she comes next time with the procurement strategy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And just to address the third question, yes, we are having very active discussions with University of Huddersfield, Kirklees College, other partners around, I guess, almost the totality of that construction labour requirement over the next decade. So thinking about not only the council's capital programme, but transpan and upgrade some of the major NHS and other projects, as well as some of the private sector schemes that we've been talking about. Very important that we're able to understand in overall terms what the likely requirement for different roles and skills is going to be, and in some cases have that dialogue early enough to be able to shift the dial in terms of the provision which is available, the training and the courses which are available locally. So hugely important, and our ability to look at that picture in the round, as well as ensuring that on a project by project basis we're extracting as much social value as possible is really important. But yes, those conversations are happening, and I hope that gives you some assurance on that.
Thank you. We've been at this for 50 minutes. I'm going to try and bring this to a close, but I can see, Paul, you've got your hand up. Is it a quick comment? Because we are going to grill you in a bit.
Okay, very quick comment. I think something just to emphasise throughout all the and be really good discussion is, a real focus for us is obviously that we've got control in terms of a significant procurement arena for the council, and that's not all of what we've been talking about, but this will be something that will come forward. I know when we talk about procurement, and we can make a real difference in terms of delivery of these aspirations on the ground through our power as an organisation, and through that to set examples and new ways of approaching this. So I know there's been a lot of discussion about developers and about builders. Clearly, that's an area which we have to work in partnership and talk to people. But don't forget, you know, we have a massive spend and a massive procurement area that we can create these deliverables for people at Kirklees and actually to influence this as well. So that's really it, John. That's all I want to say.
So I'm going to bring this to a close. I'm going to thank Jonathan and Chris for their contributions. I mean, we've covered a lot. I mean, I've got quite a lot written down in terms of looking at the project cost against social value, how we benchmark, the impact on Kirklees services and the availability of apprentices and contracting staff, what remedial action will be taken if social value isn't delivered, whether we're ready to do this at scale, discussion around the concept of negative social value and the impact on planning, quite a few bits on planning and development, whether we're being more prescriptive and demanding in the new social value as against Section 106, and then how that potentially could cause us some issues with certain builders, looking at concerns about whether there'll be enough enforcement resources, whether help will be available to community groups that perhaps haven't got experience of producing social value statements, and then perhaps bringing out a little bit the differentiation between the existing policy and the new policy, and drawing out the impact, perhaps of some examples of what the existing policy had achieved as well. And hopefully that covered most of what we discussed. Well, thank you for coming. And we'll now move on to our next agenda item, which is recruitment and retention. So I think Michelle's going to chat to us.
Morning, thank you, Chair. I've got everything switched on properly. I've shared a pack of slides. I think everybody's got that in the pack, so I'm just going to talk through that this morning, if that's okay. So the recruitment and retention fits very, very much at the heart of our people strategy, in particular in our outcomes of inclusive employer of choice and skilled, flexible and engaged people, and particularly in terms of our pledges around having inclusive, safe and fair and straightforward recruitment and selection processes, about people having a warm welcome when they join Kirklees or when they move within Kirklees, and also being comfortable and confident being yourself within Kirklees as well. Today, so at Scrutiny panel today is a follow-on from, we've been to Personnel Committee twice around recruitment and retention to share updates on some of our challenges and some of our activities in support of those challenges. I suppose it's fair to say, with many organisations, both public and private sector, we do face some labour market challenges. Kirklees Council isn't immune to the challenges of the rest of the economy. So I wanted to focus in a couple of areas. So just to pick up on those labour market changes and challenges, I think it's very well publicised, but I think that graph's quite stark. The number of vacancies across the country has certainly shot up very significantly in the last 6 to 8 months. So that it looks currently around 1.3 million vacancies across the country. There's also been, the pandemic has created a bit of a reduction in the labour market as well. People have actively left the labour market, so we've got a smaller pool of people that are looking for work. So whilst what might have been, we may have expected an unemployment crisis following the pandemic, we're now facing what's described very much as one of the most challenging labour markets in the last 50 years. Some of those industries that face the biggest challenges nationally are hospitality, social care, and obviously Kirklees Council operates in those markets, so we're certainly feeling some of those challenges. In terms of our biggest market challenges, I think it's fair to say some of these would have been exactly the same challenges we'd be facing pre-pandemic as we are post-pandemic. They've just been exacerbated quite significantly. So some of our most challenging areas that I've listed there. I've also provided some statistics on a separate sheet that cover our volumes of recruitment advertising have increased very significantly over the pandemic, whereas applications have kind of plateaued and reduced in some areas. There is a peak in applications around April earlier this year. That coincides with our apprenticeship recruitment exercises, which very much attract high numbers of applications. You'll see from those statistics as well, we have appointed a significant number of people, so there are the number of appointments is increasing as well. Just to explain those, the light coloured bar is internal appointments, so internal moves within the council. The dark coloured bar is those that have joined the council from outside. Apologies, I didn't have numbers in the back. Just wanted to provide a little bit of context to it. So just to focus on a couple of areas where we're putting some specific measures in place, where there are some real challenges, particularly catering and social care. So catering are trial and talent banks to try and attract people just on a very initial conversation and then encourage them into a fuller application. Doing some trials with Indeed. I think you've probably seen that as a big job site that's incredibly easy to apply. How can we use that to generate some applications? Our COVID community support officers have been out in communities, I think particularly attending markets, particularly around catering, talking to people about the jobs that we've got available. And you may well have heard that we've got some radio advertising for both catering and social care at the moment. It always makes me jump, oh, that's Kirklees, so listen out for that one. There's recruitment events in social care. They're there's something that we've used for a long time, so social care recruitment events. And we're also looking at sort of place-based engagement. So those are some of the specific initiatives. Some of the more generic or general initiatives that we're working on at the moment. So we're developing better links with the Job Centre. So that they're trying to work with organisations to support these areas as well. So we've attended Hospitality Week and Care Week, which sit with some of our challenges. We launched our careers site last year, so we better showcase our jobs and the careers that we've got available. I don't know if you've seen that, but there's lots of videos on there that give people the opportunity to talk about what we've got, what jobs we've got and what opportunities that exist. And we can be flexible with that based on our challenges. So when we're doing our big apprenticeship, recruitment events, there's a big focus on apprenticeships. So we were able to swap and change that around. Sorry, excuse me. We're working very closely with our employment and skills colleagues around events and trying to talk about developing pipelines into the organisation. And there's also a social media campaign that's been running for a little while, focusing on catering, social care. Over the weekend, I think it focused on schools and engineering. Some of our key priorities really focusing on those ones. We also have some place-based events they've just been set up for autumn, so we'll share some more information as detail comes through, but those are in October and November, one in North Kirklees, one in South Kirklees. So those will be kind of trying to talk about all the job opportunities that we've got across the council. We also, what the pandemic has taught us is that what's really important to people that are looking for work is flexibility. It's top of people's kind of wish list. So we're very much trying to push that wherever it is possible in jobs. It's, what are the possibilities around flexibility? How can we promote those? We're working with an organisation called Timewise. We've recently got accreditation with that, and we're working with those in the future to try and embed flexibility and options for flexibility further across the organisation. We need to keep so we're working with recruiting managers on trying to keep shortlisting criteria to an absolute minimum. In a tight labour market, we need to keep to a minimum what we expect of people to get them through the door, and then talk to them a bit more in more detail in selection processes. We're working very closely with managers on the need for pace in a fast recruitment market. There is perhaps previously, sorry, excuse me, we may have kind of talked about giving people a week's notice or more for interviews. That's not what people are looking for. They're looking for instant application, almost instant interviews after that. So how can we keep pace with those expectations? We do make use of market supplements and retention payments in some areas where we're significantly out of line with the market. Those are temporary arrangements based on current market conditions. We're working with our Iroco project and I&D Hub, and particularly about how we can make a difference with some of our recruitment activity as well. There are lots of system developments in terms of our recruitment system, making that as straightforward as possible. We can now put videos in adverts. The application is significantly simpler. And just to support that, I've just popped some feedback from applicants in there where we're getting incredibly positive feedback at the point of application. We know we need to do a bit more in capturing feedback elsewhere in the selection process, but we think it's a good place to start and something to build on. So there's lots of things that we're doing around recruitment. One of the other things that we're focusing on over summer is we're talking to all of the community hubs about how we can best get our jobs into communities. So that's perhaps something that we'd love to talk to you a bit more about and share some of the suggestions that we get from those community hubs about how we can get our jobs into communities. So whilst we've talked about those bigger events, how can we do some of that in a smaller scale? So things like having bits of drop-ins in libraries. There is a bus that we're looking to take closer to one of our care homes where we have particular issues. So how can we really get into our communities? So that's a big focus for us at the moment. And also working with the Job Centre Plus, how we can get into the Job Centre to talk to people directly, whether we put one of our team in there to talk to people. How do we do things like that? So there's lots of things around kind of those short-term, reactive, in the now recruitment activity. In terms of support into employment, we've got a lot of activity going on specifically to help people into the labour market. So hopefully you've heard of our hugely successful Project Search initiative, which supported young people with learning disabilities and or autism to get experience in work. Hugely positive outcomes for those individuals, their families, and also a lot of people have moved on into employment, some of those in the council, which is incredibly positive. So that's something that we're moving into business as usual. There's a wider council-wide project on neurodiversity to build on the learning that we have from that project. We've also ring-fenced some apprenticeships to support those people as well. And we have 13 new interns starting with us in September, so certainly something that we'll be building on. As I mentioned before, we've got a very strong record in apprenticeships, so this continues to grow. I've popped in there a kind of a list of some of the apprenticeships that we've offered this year that's a lot wider than perhaps some of our traditional apprenticeships, so certainly working on those, and particularly at higher level, we're seeing some of those graduate apprenticeships come through as well. We also have our Kirklees Apprenticeships for All project, which helps support both the council and other organisations in Kirklees to try and utilise apprenticeships and the apprenticeship levy to grow their own workforce, so developing our workforce as well as bringing in, I suppose, what we term the traditional apprenticeships. And then you may recall the government-funded Kickstart programme. So we had 72 placements, Kickstart placements in Kirklees. 14 of those converted into council jobs, and a further 18 converted into other employment. And on the basis that the scheme was designed for 16 to 18-year-olds who were at risk of long-term unemployment, we're really pleased with the outcomes for those individuals. And I think just that over 70 young people will have now had experience of working in local government when they perhaps might not have done in the past, so can go share some of those, a bit more about what the council does and share it as an opportunity. Another example of some of our support into employment and very much kind of getting into the school system is work experience. So during the pandemic, when we were unable to offer our traditional face-to-face work experience, we developed a virtual work experience offer, which has been incredibly positive and something that we have now built into our business as usual. So I think so nearly 40 students over, I think about a month ago, we did 2 sessions in Thornhill and Westborough. So over 40 students had 2 days of experience of different council services doing kind of really practical activities. They were building bridges from marshmallows and spaghetti. They were designing playgrounds, designing kitchens on budget. That was engineering, that one. And lots of different project management, lots of different, just a bit of exposure to the different services that we've got in the council. And I think the really positive bit from that is I think almost all of them in the feedback said that they would consider Kirklees as a career opportunity in the future. So if they go then home and talk to their friends and families about that, we think that's really positive, so something that we really want to build on in the future. In the much longer term, we're also very much working on workforce planning and embedding workforce planning approaches across the council. We're currently in piloting stage. Workforce planning is essentially having the right people with the right skills, values and behaviours in the right job at the right time, right number, and very importantly for us, representative of our communities. So it's really, what we really want to focus on is looking forward what might be needed in the future, what skills might be needed in the future that could be very different, and we know they will be very different to those that we need today. So those pilot areas are very much connected to those areas where we have the challenges, so we're trying to hit kind of every angle. We've got short, medium and long-term opportunities there. We're one of 10 local authorities that have some dedicated local government association support around adult social care workforce planning. So we're kind of down the way of that pilot at the moment. And we're very much wanting to focus on critical roles and succession planning in the immediate term before looking at the much longer term workforce planning. I've just shared a bit of our kind of approach, which is based on the LGA approach. Really important is around focus on retentions of our existing workforce. We need to keep hold of the workforce that we do have, as well as trying to attract new people into the organisation. So we've got a number of initiatives that we're working on to support retention. So recently there's been a welcome event for people who've joined in the last 2 years. So I think over 100 have attended already, and there are another 200 booked or on waiting list for those that are coming up. So I think that's just a really, in that kind of face-to-face environment, getting a little bit more of that wider what Kirklees is like, rather than perhaps whilst we've been in the pandemic, being focused a little bit more on your own job and your own service. We've undertaken some frontline worker engagement sessions through the people strategy, which again is giving us some real intelligence about how we can do things differently, because everybody's experiences are very different in the council. The exec team have held listening sessions throughout last summer and this summer to talking to our workforce about what they like and we could do better. We're developing stay interviews. So talking to people about why they like working in Kirklees and what keeps them in Kirklees, as well as alongside that revitalising exit interviews. So we've launched an online exit interview. Return is relatively low, so we're revitalising that, try and get a bit more intelligence there. I've talked about embedding flexibility wherever possible before as well, and absolutely key for us is focus on wellbeing. So what wellbeing initiatives have we got to support our existing workforce? I think that was a bit of a whistle-stop of all the things that we've got going on at the moment.
Thanks, Michelle. I'll let you catch breath now. but thank you for that. And I think it is a whistle-stop tour, and there's a lot there. And I hope people had an opportunity to read some of the slides beforehand. So I'm going to make it, open to the panel if anyone has any questions.
Okay, thank you, John. And as an engineer who's done the spaghetti and marshmallow one, yeah, it's initiation is that waste of damn good marshmallows, in my opinion, but there you go. I'm more concerned about you talked about, but I understand the challenging market that we're in and sort of the efforts that you're doing immediately in the medium term and the long term. But I'm more concerned about the immediate sort of skills shortage that we have, particularly on skills, regarding, for instance, there's a job role in planning, where you've got an immediate need. Now, you're not going to get a trained planner right out the gate, out of the job market, or if you do, I recommend buying a lottery ticket on the same day as well, because that's very good luck. So what is there being done within the council such to perhaps identify skills that are transferable and say this person isn't going to be there right out the gate, but with at least, we're going to be in a position where we can train them up, and maybe just in that little period there, they'll be doing some good for us and alleviating some of the stresses. I use planning as an example, but I know across the board you've got situations like that.
Yes, absolutely. We do, and very much when I've talked about workforce planning, one of the other priorities within that is skills analysis from trying to look at that kind of across services, and where I suppose the value that we'd add from a HR perspective is taking that kind of, I suppose, a bit more of a helicopter view, understanding where there are skills in some services that there may be opportunities. It's not there immediately now, but it's certainly something that's in our priorities on workforce planning, to understand the skills across the organisation better.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thanks for the report, Michelle. It's good to sort of keep posted on that on the personnel committee as well. So this is all familiar territory, but very encouraged by what we're hearing about the flexibility side of things, about the concentrating on, because people don't always work just for the money. It's often the terms and conditions. It's often the people they're working with, and the atmosphere that they're working with as well, and that impact on the home life as well. How flexible, how well we get to know them, what their family situations are like, what they need from us, not just what we need from them. So encouraging to hear that work's going on. I think I've said in other places about re-employment, about keeping the little black book, and keeping tabs of the people who've worked for us in the past, and just reaching out and just making sure that the door's open to the right ones, of course, but just to make sure that the door's open to the people we want to keep in touch with. I will flag the warning again about beggar thy neighbour, about falling into beggar thy neighbour, because that's quite a destructive pattern to get into with the regions. So it's one of those things that is very tricky, because sometimes it's hard to avoid, because people will just go with a trend and they will move from authority to authority. So it's hard to know what's kind of active recruitment and what's not really. There was just something else there. No, it's gone. I ran out of steam.
You can always come back.
Yes, absolutely. So flexibility is absolutely critical to us, and I think what we're really conscious of is the experience of flexibility across the organisation is very different. So how can we look at what opportunities may exist, particularly in more frontline roles where there are more restrictions on how we can make that feel more flexible across the whole of the organisation. In terms of the point that you make about kind of our neighbours, it's something we're incredibly conscious of. We are working as part of our local government association links. I know there's a new project starting looking at kind of data and intelligence, so bringing all our colleagues together about and looking at those kind of things, because when we're in those arenas, it's both frightening and reassuring at the same time that everybody's in a very similar boat, and I think we're all very conscious of I've heard it recently from somewhere else, if we win, it doesn't mean that everybody else, we might make other people lose across the sector as well. So we have to it's something that we're very conscious of and be very careful of.
Thanks, Michelle. John, do you want to come back?
It came back to me. So you did touch actually on some of the kind of mapping about where people have gone, where our own people have gone, and I think that might be particularly interesting. Do we have an idea? Are they going mainly to private sector, or are they just stopping working? And just what do those figures look like, and it's just about how we can focus on our dwindling forces on those particular areas, It's just be nice to have an idea of that.
In terms of that, we're actively looking at the moment in terms of a comparison, because we're conscious of whether retirements have gone up or not in terms of our turnover, so that's something that we're actively looking at. And when we're looking at revitalising our exit interviews, being a little bit more specific about where people are going. We have pockets where we've brought in kind of large numbers throughout the pandemic, so our COVID community support officers, we've got a bit more detail about where they've gone in the council and where they've gone outside of the council, so it's something we're very much looking on.
Thanks, Michelle. If I can chip in with a question, although I apologise, I think I raised this question when we had the lead briefing as well. Tyler touched on planning, and planning is one of the points that probably a lot of us as councillors are hearing noise about the length of time it's taking for planning decisions to come through, and that's not criticism of any officers, that's just a consequence of volume. One of the suggestions was whether we could, and this may happen elsewhere where we've got specific skill shortages, is reach out to our colleagues that have retired to see if they would be willing to come back for a short period just to help get through the volume, and whether we've started doing any of that and whether we've had any success in that space.
So not specifically in planning, but it's something we can certainly look at. I think planning is one of all of those initiatives that I've talked about. I think planning ticks all of those boxes about using all those initiatives in there. But absolutely, yes, certainly something that we'll pick up with planning in particular, but across the board. Throughout the pandemic, in particular around social care, we was a lot of reaching out to people whether they wanted to come back. I know there were a couple of initiatives through the LGA around, I think planning was one of them. There was something on legal and social work. I've not seen anything about how particularly successful they were. I think there is a lot of information or suggestion in the media at the moment about people perhaps maybe looking towards a return to the workforce. So it's certainly something we will explore.
I was thinking more a short-term thing. Somebody who's retired, we can appeal to them because they work for us for a long time and say, we need your help. We need your help just for a couple of months. Would you come and help us? It's that sort of personal approach. Not trying to get them back into the workforce for good, but just to help lift, because you're conscious of the impact on officers of having that overburdened workload continually. We need to find some way to break that cycle.
Yes, absolutely. It's certainly something that we'll take away and make sure we look at.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, John. Thanks, Michelle, for the presentation. Sort of someone I've been through some very challenging application process, and I can see from the feedback you're getting that it's really important. That is very simple, very accessible. Very pleased by that feedback. Just looking at the other end of things, retention mainly, we touched on it. Do we sort of analyse how many leavers, I don't even know if we have this kind of insight, but do we look at how many leavers could have reasonably been, prevented from leaving? So do we sort of ask them if if they could have been prepared to continue with Kirklees Council if sort of changes were made? There can be sort of things that leavers might find it difficult to volunteer themselves, like if they've had difficult relationships with line managers or colleagues, that we might sort of have to probe specifically or encourage them if they're willing to discuss those matters. So I just want to know a bit more about the push factors, if possible.
So in terms of the bits that I've mentioned around stay interviews and exit interviews, I think that's the space we really want to get to. So hopefully if we get stay interviews that kind of capture people before they're in that space of thinking, and I suspect some of our, in trying to make exit interviews more effective, is how can we get them at an earlier stage? So and part of those questions may well be, is what could we do to keep you out of those kind of questions? So it's really reassuring to hear that, because I think that's the direction that we want to go with those things.
Yeah, sure. Do we get many who say thanks but no thanks when they apply, and then turn around and say, oh no, and then what would their reasons be? Because sort of my, you spoke a bit on the speed of the application process. I mean, the big thing for me in my most recent job is I knew about the job on Thursday, I had the interview on Friday, and had the job on Monday, and that's the sort of thing you're up against. And I'm just wondering, is the speed of the application the main thing for them? Is it salary offers? When you get people who say, I appreciate the offer, but I've got a better one, or I'm doing something else, what feedback from them do you get?
So it happens with increasing frequency, I think, and I think that's a reflection of the labour market. But I think we can't guarantee that just because somebody applies for a job, they're going to come to an interview, that they come to an interview, that they're going to take the job. So we've got to be much more engaging throughout the whole of the process. In terms of those that don't take up, I think we are conscious we do have to do a number of pre-employment checks that sometimes are a bit more onerous than other organisations. We do try and keep those as limited as possible, but there are some where we can't make any excuses. There are things that we've got to do. So we try and keep it as fast as possible. I think we are a victim sometimes that in applying for jobs, people may have applied for a number of jobs at the same time. So that pushing the pace, how can we do things faster? Everything that we can do within our control is how we're tackling that.
Thank you. Steve, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, thanks, John. That what you've just mentioned about asking retired staff to come back to help out, I think it's a great idea. It's something that we did, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago in housing. We had a problem with a load of managers who all came through ranks together. They'd been working together for many years, and it come to a stage where a lot of them were retiring. Now, quite a few of them did come back, even if it's only two days a week or 3.5 days a week. At least it helped us out. And the other thing is, I know from a planning point of view, while we're setting new members of staff on who are going to college on Thursdays for training, etc., we're still losing 1 or 2 high-flying officers, which is a bit of a worry. And we're losing them, obviously, to private sector because COVID now settled down, we're over it, and everybody's getting stuck in building, etc., etc. Trying to keep his own staff's a bit of a problem. But in the main, I think in certain departments, a trawl of ex-employees would be a good idea, and see if we can get some back just on part-time basis. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Steve. Just going to bring John back in.
Thanks, Chair. The picture that we've got in front of us in the update is a really very quite turbulent one. There's a lot of churn going on. There's a lot of movement. It's very fluid. One of the risks I think we're exposed to here is a lack of skills exchange. As people are coming into post or going out of post, are we paying any particular attention to that skills exchange about how we decant one person's head into another just so that the service is still viable?
I'm smiling because that's something that we were looking at last week. Yes, absolutely. So we were looking around at what others do, particularly around knowledge transfer. So we found a couple of really good examples that we want to kind of try and build on. I mean, I think it's probably particular at senior level with a lot of that kind of organisational knowledge, the things that you perhaps might not think to write down in a handover. So how can we try and get that everything that's in somebody's head transferred over? So absolutely, we're doing some of that piloting through our workforce planning activity.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think I'm going to bring this one to a close. Just a comment for Councillor Davies. He might want to pick up on those students in North Kirklees that are building kitchens on a budget. Given the challenges you've got with budgets and large projects, they may be able to help you. But I'd just like to thank Michelle for her contribution. We talked about skills shortages, transferable skills, and how staff perhaps could help out in areas where they had similar skills but perhaps not the full skill set, looking at reasons for leaving and how we're going to improve the exit interviews to get a better understanding of the reasons for people leaving on a similar level where we've offered people jobs and they then turn them down, a better understanding of why we weren't able to bring those people on board. We've sort of welcomed the work that you've done on simplifying application processes and the flexibility that's offered almost as a given now across the board. You also made a suggestion around appealing to some of our retired colleagues, perhaps come back and help out and give us a lift in certain areas, and then very much that talk about how do you do that organisational knowledge transfer and skills exchange when people are leaving or retiring. But I think we had a good one, and thank you, because you did cover a lot of ground in a short period. So thank you, Michelle. And I would like to welcome both David and Jill. Got your name for a second then, Jill, that's awful. They're going to talk to us a little bit about the access strategy. This is an additional item we added after the work programme was agreed on the back of some challenges that the customer service centres were facing. We thought, given they'd been facing some challenges, it's probably worth a look at that. And I'll hand it over to Jill and Dave, who want to just take us through that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As the Chair has just outlined, this update is a focus on the work undertaken as part of the access strategy and its implementation, which was based on 4 key principles. Specifically today, the update is on getting the basics right. and as part of that, as already has been mentioned, an update on the impacts on our performance and getting those basics right post-COVID, and some of the other current impacts, and some of, importantly, the planning that we are doing to try and get to mitigate against some of those impacts. So I'll hand over to Dave, who will take us through the detail of the report.
Okay, thanks Jill, thanks Chair. This update's on pages 49 to 53 inclusive in your pack. Jill's reminded you about what the principles are and what we're looking at today. I wanted to bring you up to date on a couple of things within the principle getting the basics right, which is what we've been concentrating on for a period of time. The first is we are in the process of developing a specification for procuring a new telephony system, and that includes a new switchboard. And we expect this to go live during 23-24. Now, our current systems are over 12 years old, and what we've had to do, we've had to procure a like-for-like system in the short term whilst we get this specification developed. We know there is lots of opportunity out there and massively improved products that some organisations have, and we want to take advantage of that moving forward. So that's the first thing, and for us that's really exciting, but it takes up resources, but the team are working really well together. And I think we have to remember that it's not just some of our partners are actually involved in this as well. So it's not just council services like the big ones, obviously Kirklees Direct, who have more than 40 services that they support through the contact centre, and Gateway to Care and Children's, but we've also got our health partner Locala and obviously Homes and Neighbourhoods who utilise the same systems. So we're working closely as a team to develop that specification. The second bit I wanted to bring you up to date on was I think you may remember me coming to talk to you in November. Some of you were on the panel at the time, back in November last year. People were identified when we came with the strategy that had been to Cabinet in October. People have frustrations. This is the feedback that we get, not only from the staff within Kirklees Direct and the customer service centres and Homes and Neighbours, but they have frustrations that they have to contact different people to deal with their calls. Because what we've developed in the past have been service specific. And what we want to do, and you may remember this, is that we need to review our processes in co-production with citizens, their carers in some instances, but those people who use the services, and obviously customer service staff have got a mass of knowledge around that, and they will be involved in that process. And we have a great opportunity there to improve outcomes for people. I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail, not great detail at all, but a little bit more detail when I update you on how we're performing at this moment in time. But we've identified 3 areas that citizens and our customer service staff have said they have the most problems with at the moment. Now, don't think that this is a one-off, because it's not. We are going to go through all our processes, as many as we possibly can, to identify how we can improve them to be more holistic and therefore provide better outcomes for people. And the first 3 are blue badge process and requests for housing repairs, and waste collections and contacts. Now, we're going to start that in the autumn. Obviously, the staff are being trained on the new system that we're moving to at this moment in time, so we haven't had the opportunity to dedicate the resources to it, but we will be doing from the autumn. And there's an example in there, in the report, about the opportunities particularly for blue badges. So, it's a process for blue badges, but there is the opportunity for assisted bins. There's an opportunity for assisted technology for people who have certain conditions, and we need to be able to support them, and that's our aim, to do that when they're applying for that blue badge, rather than missing out or having to go elsewhere. That's another really exciting project, and we're all enthusiastic about it. I think you can tell I am. I'll move on to telephony performance. Recovery from COVID has been difficult for citizens and service delivery. Michelle's just mentioned recruitment and retention issues. I'll come on to those in a minute. But this is the same for many councils and private sector contact centres. We know that. I know that for a fact. And there are a number of things that we have learned that is specific in Kirklees. And what I've tried to do is bring you up to speed with what some of those are in the report. So first off, the cost of living crisis. Now, between in the months April, May and June, we were absolutely inundated with requests for help from people who have never claimed benefits before, and for some, the needs are getting more and more complex. And they're presenting with all sorts of different needs now that we know we can support them with, but those conversations take longer. But the outcomes for the people that we're supporting are better, because we're not just saying, okay, we'll come to an. I'm just going to use this as an example. We're not just coming to sort your council tax out. We'll put you in touch with other services and get you contact with other services and support you through that process where we can. So, for example, local welfare provision. There's all sorts of different things where we're identifying more holistic support for people. But that takes the call longer. So your call handling times are longer for those people. So moving on, recruitment and retention. So as you can see, we've had unprecedented turnover in the last 12 months, and this is in Kirklees Direct. I have had it across all my services, to be honest with you, which includes registration, birth desks and managers. It also includes the customer service centres, and people have, in relation to Kirklees Direct, we've lost over 50% of the staff who take calls in the last 12 months. That's way above our normal levels. Now, I can tell you what the vast majority, we're only talking small numbers here, by the way, so it's 46.5 full-time equivalents and we've lost 24, so it's just over 50%, about 56%, isn't it? Something like that. But we'd normally lose about 10% in a year. We have regular churn because Kirklees Direct is a stepping stone into the local authority to do other things. And people have gone on to do all sorts of things in the last 12 months. They've gone to my registration service, robbing Peter to pay Paul Dave. I'm very sorry about that, but it's what people wanted to do. Some have gone into the waste team. Some have gone into welfare and exchequer and other services. Some have retired. Some have gone on to do big career changes, like gone into nursing. So quite a lot of my team during COVID worked in the testing centres and they worked in the vaccination centres and got really keen on doing that moving forward. So there's been churn in those areas. Now, we've lost a lot of experienced officers as well, with years of experience answering calls. When you're trying to train 50% new staff over 12 months, it's been difficult. We have managed to recruit to fill all the posts. There is general churn, obviously, but it takes time to train those staff to become comfortable with providing the service to cover a number of the 40 services that are currently supported through the contact centre. So I think that obviously goes without saying. 40 services is a lot to know, and not everybody knows everything, but to get up to a position where you're comfortable answering questions across holistic services, it takes time. And thankfully we're getting there. We have got some ongoing recruitment at this moment, so these are the actions that we're taking, and that's to further increase resources for the upcoming winter pressures. We're utilising all our resources in Kirklees Direct and customer service centres and libraries, and those working in communities to support citizens presenting appropriately where we can. And we've got, we did this during when we came out of COVID, not during COVID, because most of those were shut. But it was providing them with FAQs and contact numbers, etc., to support people in the appropriate way. They can't do it all, but they can do a significant chunk of it. So that's utilising all our resources, and I'm pleased to say, during July and early August, we've seen an improvement in the number of calls answered. Now, that's the newer staff starting to take effect. It's also a fact that during the summer months, we get a reduction in calls, but we also have higher leave commitments as well, as every organisation would. So that's That's good, and that is encouraging for what's going to be, what we're expecting to happen over the next few months as we try and support people with further cost of living impacts. Now, we know that it's the energy companies that will be supporting and certainly paying making those payments, not the local authority, not us as Kirklees. But we also know that one of the first ports of call for support is to the council, and we're trying to get us prepared for that as much as we possibly can. In fact, staff are interviewing today for more, and today, tomorrow and Wednesday, for additional staff to come in and support us, and we probably think we'll have them supporting us with specific things rather than try to cover the whole thing, because that's what we would normally do initially. So that's our whistle-stop tour. I can talk for ages, I'm not going to. It's more important to have the debate and any questions that anybody's got. Quite happy to answer them, aren't we, Jill?
Thanks, Dave and Jill. And I think you've finished on one of the most important points. Is start looking forward, isn't it? That we all know that the winter months are going to be difficult, and you're absolutely right that the first point of call is going to be their local council for people that need help. So it's great to hear that you're thinking forward, and sort of trying to get as best we can in a position to be ready. But I'll open it up to members.
Thanks, and thanks for the report. The example that we have of the 50% churn, and we've staffed back up again, and so it is churn, it's not loss, that's encouraging of one thing. I think what I'd ask is, with the 50% who remained, did we say thank you? We did. Yes. Yeah, good. Because it's, that's the kind of thing, those people left behind will have been under enormous pressure to get the job done and to keep that system from collapsing completely. I should imagine that that's what they managed. So yes, so actually, I mean, I'll thank them now, to be honest with you, in this public space. But yeah, it seems very important that if we're going to talk about retention as we did in the previous item, then that's very much how we should be treating our staff who remain, is actually recognising that loyalty and that commitment that they've shown. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Councillor Lawson. They'll be really pleased to hear that. I mean, I know me, Jill, and the managers say this to them all the time because they are working under tremendous pressure. But they'll be really glad to hear that. Thank you. And Councillor Davies does when we have our portfolio holder meeting with him. It always thanks the staff, and we pass that on.
Anybody else want? Alec?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to think about how our digital channels could maybe help alleviate some of the pressures in the call centres. For example, if we observe we're getting a lot of calls in about cost of living support and different aspects of that. Obviously on the website we've now got this support mini site, microsite. But for things like that, I think there's maybe more we can do in terms of banner on the homepage to send people there, or pushing out through our social media channels so people can just sort of find that information, and that might help reduce the number of calls that are necessary. There is also a point about use of apps, because I know the council has an app that's a bit of a legacy product by now, but that's actually a good channel where you can sort of helps to deal with things that might generate calls, like to report problems, but also if you open an app, you can just put whatever you want on that homepage, and you can change what that is like on our website to help, direct people to help, self-service, help themselves a bit more. And that might just assist with the straightforward cases and free up our officers to go into more depth with complex cases.
Thanks, Alec.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely spot on. And that's what the strategy is about, is to try and free up as much possible time as we possibly can by getting those basics right. So when I talked before about the telephony system replacement, we are looking at all that in relation to interactions with, so it's more of an omni-channel approach. And I also mentioned around the process redesign. The process redesign isn't just about telephone calls or face-to-face activity. It starts with the online process. And we know that quite a lot of people that bail out on calls, they do so to go and when they're pointed in the direction of the website that we do have and the opportunities that are on there. We know a lot of people do that, but we need more activity in that area, which is why we're concentrating on those things at this time.
Thanks, Dave. I know there's somebody in the room here who hates having to talk to people, much rather do things online if they're able. Well, in that case, I'll thank you both. I think absolutely right. Get the basics right. I think there'll be a lot of people that will welcome a new telephony system, won't they? Sometimes when you try and get through to people, it can be a little bit of a challenge, but that's part of the legacy, isn't it? And it's good to hear that that you're thinking forward, you're planning for the winter, you're doing the recruitment now, you're already thinking about how you can bring different tasks together. I love that example of the blue badge. And, well, everybody who's applying for a blue badge probably will end up needing an assisted bin at some point. So let's have that conversation now while we're talking to them. It's a great way of how we can, sort of help our residents, but also minimise the impact on the team in terms of multiple calls. So, yeah, thank you very much for coming today and sharing that with us. Thank you. Right, we'll now go back to item, whatever number it was, which is Paul. This is your opportunity to update us on the progress you made on your actions in the corporate plan. So I'll hand over to you. That's okay?
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. I think Michelle is going to put up some slides as well, possibly. If not, yeah, hopefully you may have got sight of those. I don't know if she's managing to do that. With me. Michelle, are you there? He says. Oh, right. I'll make a start anyway because we're struggling with time. So, firstly, I'll talk through some of the key achievements within the corporate services area, and I'm in the fortunate position, I guess, of coming last now that a number of these areas have already been talked through and highlighted. So I'll just briefly mention some of these again. Certainly, our one of the achievements in line with our plan was launching the Kirklees career site, and this is one of the key areas in terms of us ensuring that we can showcase the benefits of working for Kirklees and the benefits that we have for development opportunities, and that we're inclusive and absolutely a flexible employer. We've talked about project search previously, and again, Michelle referred to that in his slides. This is a fantastic internship program that we've run and continue to run, and I gather we'll have even more interns this year than last year. With regards to that, just to let you know, two of the interns from previous scheme have gained employment. 3 have applied for apprenticeships within the council, and also 9 are currently on placement in the council. So it isn't just a one-off scheme. This is actually giving these young people a real future, a real opportunity, a real future. Where I can see the slides are starting to come up. There we go. We've rolled out MySpace. This is, I'm sure a number of you know this anyway, a digital engagement tool for frontline staff. And this was rolled out to over 8,000 of colleagues, something like 80%, I think, of colleagues. And there was a 30%, there's been a 30% take up. Highest levels tend to be around sort of transactional days like paydays, where we see the people accessing this scheme. But basically, frontline colleagues are now able to access pay details, council messages, discounts, etc. through MySpace. So that's actually been going very, very well. Michelle, I think, mentioned earlier on that we've achieved accreditation to time-wise. So flexible working is working really well in that regard, and certainly is a key Well, it's a key area, not just for attracting staff, but absolutely for retention of staff as well. And this is a system which helps us drive this element of cultural change as well, and different practices of flexible working. Workforce planning toolkit has been piloted, and that evaluation is due to be completed in the autumn. This is critical in relation to a number of the issues we've been talking about, but obviously when we come to some of the pressures that we face in terms of staff recruitment and again retention, and also ensuring that we are giving opportunities to people. And I think it's been a few people have talked about, how do we transfer skills, how do we create development opportunities, and certainly this is something that will help us with that overall picture. 6 of the services are now much more conversant with their demographics in terms of their workforce, and they're starting to develop plans around that. Something which I've mentioned in other arenas, in terms of the finance side of things, we know that we have a really good finance team, but a clear deliverable apart from, the obvious one of making sure we have a balanced budget and we can service our citizens through services and investment, is also the work they did in helping to deliver improved outcomes for children and young people with additional needs. And so they secured, through discussions, quite tough discussions with government, a funding so that our deficit in terms of high needs is actually now being addressed. So overall, we will now get government funding around 33.5 million. And that's towards our certainly a key issue in terms of helping us reduce our deficit in this area. We've had an early release of 13.5 million, and the remainder will be over the subsequent 4 years. We do have to ensure that we deliver in-house annual savings as well, and there is a full transformation plan. But this has been crucial and a fantastic job by Finance and Children's Services in terms of ensuring that we delivered on that. We talked earlier on quite a bit about procurement policies, but a key area which we moved into really in that discussion was around the inclusive procurement strategy that we've been developing. That's now been pulled together and is ready to be presented to Cabinet later this year in the autumn. There's been a huge amount of consultation with stakeholders on the key themes, and a crucial one we talked about at length earlier today is social value assessment of procurement activity. So that is very much about the sort of hard measures and the deliverables that will be in place to show that we are actually achieving that going forward. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. We've already talked about access strategy. Dave's given an overall view on one particular area of that, but the overall strategy is in place. There is a full implementation plan around that strategy, and that's been driven by Dave and his team, doing a great job. And there's some real, as you already heard, some real challenges and some real pressures. We've worked hard to promote digital inclusion. And through the Digital Inclusion Partnership, we delivered the Let's Talk digital survey, and that's now being used to develop plans going forward, and particularly working with our community champions. There's been a successful provision of around 10,000 laptops and Chromebooks to school children, and we're now providing some devices to community groups who work directly with children. And one other area that's certainly been driven by Terence and his team is looking at how we can improve internet connectivity across a whole range of areas to help support students, and whether that, the obvious areas that we've been working on are libraries and leisure centres. So that work is continuing as well, because clearly it isn't just about hardware, it is about that whole issue of connectivity, and even more important, as we go through this cost of living crisis, clearly people have not got the money to pay for that service. Library services continue to provide certainly a great service to our citizens. There's increase in visits, more events, and there's that recovery from the COVID, from the era, from the pandemic. Just over 440,000 visits in this year, and over 1 million items loaned, and that's both physical and digital. Work's going on as well to look at accessibility assessments across our libraries, and these are on track to be delivered next March. And I think many of you know about our new library at Birkby and Fartown, which is really connecting with the community and providing fantastic support. They've delivered over 64 events there, with community events, a whole range of things from mental health support, literacy, support for young people in terms of and older people for applying to university and colleges. So those are again fairly whistle-stop tour around some of our achievements. In terms of challenges, if you can move on to the next slide, please. Some of these will have been no surprise to anybody in this meeting. Obviously, the increased cost of living is going to worsen inequalities and increase demand and cost of council services. That's certainly a challenge right across my portfolio and our services. The recovery from COVID-19 pandemic is still there. I know we say that we've come through that, but some of those challenges still there, and there's still a legacy from that to be dealt with as well. We've already talked about the recruitment challenges. They're hugely significant, and we know that that's shaping, what we're trying to do, or shaping, some of the challenges around how we provide services going forward, and that's been addressed, as you heard earlier. Dave sort of touched a little bit on this, I think, but demand is not just increasing, but it's becoming really complex, or much more complex. So when people are now contacting the council, it's generally not just for one thing. It's quite often for a range of issues, and particularly in the areas of special needs, adult social care. There are real complexities. So when our staff are dealing with some of these requests and some of these questions, quite often there are a number of different points to which they're directing people and getting support from them. We've talked about procurement, but there are one thing we've not talked about is the significant procurement challenges, but changes to the global market. There's pressures right through almost everything you can think of, and at the moment I'm told particularly around the procurement of IT equipment. And going back to some of the early discussion about our ambitions to ensure that we provide better access and easier access, particularly digitally, then obviously that's a concern for us as well. And we do know and we see increases in cyber threats. That's something which constantly our team are working on. We've got some really resilient set up within our organisation. However, the truth is, with these kinds of attacks, you can never make everything completely 100% future-proofed, and that work will continue constantly. It is not something which is you stand still on, and Terence and the team are constantly looking at how we work with other partners as well to ensure that our organisation is not prone to any of these attacks, and particularly things like, as we know, we've seen these quite often, these ransom attacks as well. So those are some of the challenges going forward. I won't go through my priorities again, but just leave not much time, but if there's any questions or anything anybody you wanted to raise with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I think the presentation was helpful, but it didn't actually address what the ask was. And I think this in part is partly my fault, because you and I haven't had a brief before the meeting. At the last meeting, we asked if you could come along today and provide an update on progress on your agreed actions in the corporate plan. So what I was expecting was to see the actions in the corporate plan, what we'd set out in terms of our intentions and what we'd actually achieved. So that's why I've been a bit distracted while you've been talking, because I've been just quickly getting Jenny to pull up the corporate plan and have a look at what the actions are you had in the corporate plan. The first action you had in the corporate plan was to bring forward a revised procurement strategy by January 22. So that hasn't come forward yet. It's coming to scrutiny next month, but that's 8 or 9 months late.
Yep.
So what went wrong with bringing the procurement strategy for January?
I think, John, to be fair, this is a little bit unfair in terms of asking the question at this point. I'd have to sit down and get a detailed response to that. But that's not what I was expecting. What I was expecting today was to go through our key achievements. But in overall terms, it would be simply an issue of both a combination of pressures within that team and the detailed work that they need to go. But I would have to go through that and go through that in detail with you.
With respect, Paul, that was what the ask was, and the agenda item says Cabinet Member for Corporate Services will provide an update on progress on his agreed actions in the corporate plan.
That's what I've just said.
But
well, I've just given you that. It's going to be delivered in your order.
With respect, Paul, you haven't explained to us why we set out an ambition in the corporate plan to produce a new procurement strategy by January 22, and we haven't done it. Similarly, the long-term comms strategy was due in April 2022, and we haven't done it. So, as the Cabinet Member responsible, and apologies, I am new to chairing scrutiny, but I see my job as a critical friend. My job is to hold you to account for what you say you're going to do. So in the corporate plan, you set out what you're going to do. So I think our role is to say to you, did you do what you said you were going to do? And if you didn't do it in the timescales you said you were going to do it, we'd expect to understand why that hadn't been done. So I think it's unfair for me to ask you to answer all those questions today, because clearly you haven't been planned and briefed for it. But if I can, I'd ask if we carry this item forward to the next scrutiny meeting, where we can have a proper discussion, because there is no point in us having an action plan attached to a corporate plan if then we're not going to have people who are actively managing it. And we need to get better at, if we're saying we're going to do things by certain dates, making sure that somebody has accountability for making sure those things happen by that date and they don't get missed by months and no clear reason as to why. So I do feel I put you on the spot, Paul, and I don't intend to do that. I had hoped you'd read the agenda item and you'd understood the discussion we had at the last meeting, but clearly somewhere our wires have got crossed. So let's do it at the next meeting. I think it'd be a much fairer and better way to do that rather than try and do it in this meeting now. And I'm just looking at the panel to see what the panel's view is. Yeah. So I think in that case, Paul, thank you for providing an update, but our job is to scrutinise, and it is to hold you as executive to account. So we'll look at that at our next meeting, if that's okay.
Yeah, we can. Well, that can be provided. We can. There's no issue why we can't provide that anyway before that to panel members anyway. There's no problem with that. That wasn't my understanding what we were looking at, but that's fine. Yeah, we can do that. That's not an issue, John, at all.
Okay. Well, I think that's closed our formal agenda. We got at the back. We've got our the work programme for our next meeting. We've got that with us. I just want to go to our next meeting, which is the 19th of September, which will largely be a financial update and a look at the finances and another look at our response to cost of living. So I think they're the things that we're bringing forward. We've also given you a copy of the forward plan. I'd ask you that you look through that, and if anything jumps out from there that you think this is something I'd like us to look at through the scrutiny panel, please bring to my attention so we can fit it in on the work panel. Okay? All right? I'd like to thank everyone for attending, including those who are on the here with us virtually, and we'll formally close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.